Well, this definitely deserves a video response.
How do we know where loanwords come from?
Over the last few weeks, I've received several comments asking essentially the same question. Why, when we find lexical similarities between Proto-Uralic and Proto-Indo-European, do linguists so often conclude that Uralic borrowed from Indo-European rather than the other way round? Some people asked this perfectly reasonably, others were less than polite, shall we say, and suggested that these conclusions are based on a belief that Indo-European languages are somehow, in some way, superior. So I want to use this video to explain more generally how linguists try to determine the direction of borrowing between languages. This isn't going to be an amazingly complex video, really we're just going to cover some of the basic principles. The direction of borrowing is, of course, not decided by which language family is larger, better known, or considered more prestigious. Instead, linguists examine evidence involving sound correspondences, word formation, chronology, geographical distribution, and the wider history of a term. They then take all of this evidence and try to piece everything together, rather like a detective trying to solve a murder mystery or something like that. However, when piecing all these clues together, we rarely have complete certainty. This is often reflected in the cautious language scholars use when discussing loanwords in the literature, and in the fact that there is very often some disagreement within the academic community regarding the origins of particular words. Opinions on the matter can change or be refined over time. All of this is good and to be expected. Now I'm going to begin by saying that if you don't want to believe what I've got to say today, don't just take my word for these things. Check out Lord Campbell's Historical Linguistics and Introduction. Chapter 3 covers borrowing, and it aligns pretty closely with everything I'm going to present today, but of course Campbell presents it in a much better way than I ever could. So how do linguists decide which language borrowed a word from which? Well, let's take this particular example that one viewer took issue with. It is a proposed loan from Proto-Indo-European into Proto-Uralic. The Proto-Indo-European term means to give, while the Proto-Uralic term means to bring, give, or sometimes fetch. And it is actually a really good example of how phonological evidence can be used to determine the direction of a loan. And we can begin analysing this word simply by looking at the two consonant values. Now actually, when you consult the literature, phonological evidence is probably the most common source of clues used by linguists to justify the proposed direction of a loanword. But it is not the only source, and I'm personally a big fan of morphological evidence, which we will come to in a moment. So let's take this first consonant. In Proto-Indo-European, it belonged to a series containing two other values. So we have a voiceless stop, a voice stop, which is the value shown here, and a voiced aspirated stop. Proto-Uralic, however, did not have a comparable series of voice stops. So if this term was indeed borrowed from Proto-Indo-European, Uralic speakers would probably have tried to find a consonant that approximated the Indo-European source sound. The voice stop in Proto-Indo-European could therefore have been replaced by this voiceless alternative in Proto-Uralic. If the loan occurred in the opposite direction, from Proto-Uralic into Proto-Indo-European, we would have to explain why Proto-Indo-European speakers changed the voicing of this consonant despite having no apparent difficulty pronouncing the original Proto-Uralic value. Of course, it is entirely possible that this happened and that some unknown process was involved. But the simpler explanation is a direction of borrowing from Proto-Indo-European into Proto-Uralic. If we look at the second consonant, we have a laryngeal in the Indo-European term. The exact phonetic values of the various Proto-Indo-European laryngeals remain debated in the literature. And interestingly, the exact phonetic value of the corresponding consonant in the Uralic term is also debated. However, some authors have speculated that the Proto-Uralic value may itself have had some kind of laryngeal-like quality. So again, we could be seeing an attempt by Uralic speakers to approximate the Indo-European sound. Then it is much more likely that the direction of travel was from Proto-Indo-European into Proto-Uralic rather than the other way round, as the other way round requires some additional explanations. However, it is also entirely possible that these two terms are simply unrelated and happen to look somewhat similar. In fact, an Indo-European origin for this Uralic term is debated in the literature, primarily because the meanings do not match particularly neatly. The meaning give on the Uralic side is only marginally distributed and may reflect a later real innovation rather than the original Proto-Uralic meaning. There is also a bit of a broader methodological issue. Because the Proto-Indo-European stop system was much more elaborate than the Proto-Uralic one, there are at least 3 potential Indo-European stop values that might be compared with a single Proto-Uralic value. When we're dealing with very short reconstructed forms, this dramatically increases the likelihood of false accidental matches. The phonological evidence at hand also fails to tell us exactly when the borrowing took place. It is entirely possible that the term entered Uralic after Proto-Uralic had already begun splitting into its primary branches, and that the loanword then travelled across the Uralic dialect continuum. To answer questions of this kind, we need to collect more evidence. It may not even have come from Proto-Indo-European directly either, but a daughter language like, say, Tocharian. Check out my previous video if you're interested in learning why that could be important. Nevertheless, if the two words are related, the most likely explanation remains that the term was borrowed into Uralic from Proto-Indo-European. Morphology and internal structure can also reveal the direction of travel. For example, a lexical item may be clearly built from several meaningful elements in one language, but treated as a single, unanalysable word in another. Take, for example, the word alcohol. It is said to derive ultimately from the following Arabic term with some degree of semantic change. How do we know that English ultimately borrowed the term from Arabic rather than the other way around? Well, it doesn't look particularly like a native English term for one, but more importantly, we cannot break the word down into smaller meaningful parts in English. In Arabic, however, the word clearly contains 2 recognisable elements: the definite article al, meaning the, and the noun, referring originally to a fine powder. This strongly suggests the direction of borrowing from Arabic into English. The language in which the form has some kind of internal explanation will very often be the donor language. Alligator is another good example. In English, it is not morphologically analysable, but it comes from a Spanish expression literally meaning the lizard. Of course, this only helps establish the direction of travel. It does not tell us exactly how the word ended up in English. That story is itself slightly more complicated. Recently, we covered Proto-Dravidian on this channel, and Dravidian can also provide us with a good example. Consider the following Sanskrit word, meaning blind in one eye. To be clear, the etymology of this word is debated, and an Indo-European origin has been proposed. Nevertheless, some scholars, and I would actually be inclined to agree with them, argue that the word is of Dravidian origin. Why? Well, its form can be broken down and explained more effectively in Dravidian. Some scholars have analysed the term as deriving from a Dravidian verb meaning to see, combined with a Proto-Dravidian negative suffix. And we see similar formations of lexical items elsewhere across Dravidian. Because the word is further analysable in Dravidian, because in very basic terms we can break it down into small and meaningful pieces in Dravidian, this is considered a strong piece of evidence in favour of Dravidian being the donor language. But again, the etymology is debated, as is so often the case with proposed loanwords. The important point is that scholars do not simply assume that the word must be inherited from Indo-European just because it occurs in an Indo-European language. The discussion is much more nuanced than that. And again, we must just remember these two words might just look similar and not actually be related at all. Another clue linguists can use to determine the direction of borrowing is the distribution of cognates across a language family. If a word has regular cognates across several branches of one family, but appears only in a single language or a small group of closely related languages in another family, this usually suggests that the family with the wider distribution was the source. Usefully, Campbell provides us with a great example in his book. He discusses the following Finnish term, meaning daughter. The word has related forms elsewhere in the Finnic branch, but no convincing inherited cognates across the wider Uralic family. By contrast, the Indo-European word for daughter has regular cognates across numerous branches that are widely separated both geographically and chronologically, including Sanskrit and English. Campbell therefore concludes that the word was borrowed from an early Baltic Indo-European language into Finnic rather than in the opposite direction. Finally, geography, ecology and cultural history can also help. Words for newly encountered plants, animals, technologies or customs are often borrowed from the people who introduced them, but these are generally weaker clues and should support phonological and morphological evidence rather than replace it. There are many nuances and complexities involved in analysing loanwords and determining their direction of travel. As I mentioned in the beginning, it is very much like detective work, particularly when we're dealing with less obvious examples. And I understand why people might question the apparent one-way street in proposed loans between Indo-European and Uralic at the proto level. Indo-European certainly receives a great deal of academic attention, but quite often it is Uralicists themselves who propose or support this direction of borrowing. So the next time you see a loanword proposed somewhere, look at the kinds of evidence we have discussed today, particularly phonological and morphological clues, because they can often be the most revealing. But remember, they are still just clues. Something may have been missed, and that is why we should pay attention to alternative proposals and weigh all of the evidence together as a whole. What are some of the most interesting loanwords or loanword journeys that you know about? Please feel free to share them in the comments section below. I'll look forward to checking them out. I've been Learn Hittite, folks. I hope this clears up some of the questions people had regarding the issue. I'll be back very soon with another interesting video. You've been fantastic as always. Goodbye for now.